Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Paradiso by Terrance D. Williamson, narrated by Kirsten Potter. Chapter 1. The Devil's Demise. In the long run, the sharpest weapon of all is a kind and gentle spirit. Anne Frank. "Hey, it's nice," Constable Hevel mused as they sped over the stone bridge towards the manor of Mrs. Meyers. Glancing at Hevel, Hans was still unconvinced as to the correct course of action. Hevel and the other policemen with him were determined to murder Gustav without a trial. While Hans understood that Gustav deserved such a fate for the wicked things that he not only permitted, but also took an active part in, suspending proper justice was not something Hans was prepared to accept. Slamming on the brakes, Hans stopped the vehicle just before the doors of the manor. Leaning over the steering wheel, Hans tried to catch a glimpse into the manor through the windows, but it was difficult to decipher any movement in the dim light of the early morning hours. "Stay in the truck," Hevel ordered Hans as he checked over his pistol. "I can't let you go in alone," Hans insisted as he put the vehicle into park. "My conscience won't allow it." "Captain?" Hevel grabbed his arm and Hans looked at him with a sense of dread, grasping that Hevel was able and willing to deliver any measure that he believed would help bring about justice. "This is something we have to do." "This isn't right." Hans shook his head. "We left one of our men with his son, remember?" Hevel narrowed his gaze as he offered the veiled threat. "You wouldn't dare!" Hans couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Gustav took plenty of Jewish sons, some much younger than his own." Hevel slammed the door as he glared at Hans. "Why should his son live?" "He's just a boy," Hans shouted. "So were the Jews that he killed," Hevel shouted back as he turned and walked towards the manor with his train of policemen who were just as eager for vengeance. "This can't be happening." Hans bounced his leg as he squeezed his forehead in frustration. They'd better not hurt Eleanor. He watched in anguish as Hevel pounded his fist against the door and the policemen with him held their weapons at the ready. "I can't let them do this." Hans opened the door, but, before he stepped out, remembered Hevel's threat against Gustav's son and was concerned that he would act upon it. Furiously, Hans returned to his seat, and it took every ounce of energy he possessed to restrain his screams of frustration. With no answer to his pounding, Hevel gave a nod to his men, who then opened the unlocked doors quickly and poured into the manor with weapons raised. Hans's anxiety soared as he listened to the shouting from Hevel's men, and, as soon as the manor doors closed behind them, Hans jumped out of the vehicle. Quietly and quickly, he approached the doors and retrieved his own pistol from his holster. Hans didn't have a plan. There was no strategy burning in his mind, but he knew that he had to be prepared to do whatever was necessary to ensure that no one was killed in cold blood, regardless of how vile that person might be. He knew that he would likely fail in keeping Gustav alive, but his conscience would plague him for the rest of his days if he didn't at least try. More indistinguishable shouting came from inside the manor, and Hans looked around the entrance with the hope that he might find a side door. "I can try the back," Hans thought, but noticed that the vegetation was too thick around the sides of the house, and it would take him too long to traverse. Hevel must be bluffing, Hans thought as he gathered his courage. It's inconceivable that he would kill Gustav's son, especially when he saved me from hurting him earlier. Looks like the only way for me to enter is through the front. Slowly, Hans opened the door and peeked inside to see Constable Hevel with his gun trained to a man's head. The man was on his knees with his hands on his thighs and didn't seem to be frightened in the slightest, which was infuriating Hevel. The man simply knelt as he stared at the floor and answered Hevel calmly. "Is that Gustav?" Hans wondered as he tried to recall his likeness from the photograph he had seen earlier. Then, making a larger opening with the door, Hans looked around to see that the other policemen were distracted by Hevel's interrogation. Taking advantage of their diverted attention, Hans slipped inside and steadied the door as it closed quietly. "Stop right there!" Ludwig pointed his rifle towards the top of the stairs, and Hans noticed an elderly woman holding a candle, while a young, frightened maid stood slightly behind her. "What is your purpose?" the elderly woman demanded, and Hans assumed that she was none other than Mrs. Meyers. "We are searching for the criminal that you've been harboring. Where is Gustav Simon?" Hevel replied, as his pistol remained trained on the man's head. "How dare you enter my house in such a godless fashion? This is barbaric and uncivilized behavior," Mrs. Meyers boomed as she berated the men below her. "Where is your warrant? Show me your proper papers." "Did Gustav have written orders when he hunted our people and expelled us from our homes?" Hevel countered. "You insolent wretch!" Mrs. Meyers moved swiftly down the stairs, and Hans watched in amazement as she approached Hevel without any fear of him. "Your transgression does not correct the wrongs of Gustav." "Our quarrel is not with you." Hevel held his chin high, though Hans detected that he was intimidated by her. "Hand over Gustav and we'll be on our way." "Gustav is dead." The man on his knees spoke quietly, and Hans felt his heart sink. Who killed him? Hans frowned as he thought, and why? If this was true, then he had failed in his mission to capture the Nazi alive. "What did you say?" Hevel spun towards him. "Gustav is dead," the man repeated quietly. "And who are you?" Hevel demanded impatiently. "Does it matter?" the man replied calmly. "I'm not going to ask again." Hevel cocked his pistol. "Constable!" Hans shouted as he gave away his position. "I told you to stay in the truck." Hevel looked at Hans in surprise and then in annoyance at the men for not noticing that the captain had slipped inside. "I can't let you harm that man." Hans shook his head and also drew his pistol, which Hevel was quick to take notice of. "Gustav's body is in the cellar." The man signaled to the door behind him. "Go check." Hevel nodded to Ludwig, who, grudgingly, headed towards the cellar and nervously opened the door. "There's a body," Ludwig confirmed after he had peeked inside. "Is it Gustav?" Hevel asked, while keeping his eyes locked on Hans. "It's hard to say," Ludwig called back. "Well, go find out." Hevel lost his patience, and Hans watched as sweat began to run down the constable's forehead. Timidly, the young policeman slowly descended into the cellar, fearful that someone else may be hiding down below. The seconds stretched into minutes as Hans prayed that Gustav had not been killed. He carried no sympathy for the ex-Gauleiter, but he wanted to succeed in his mission of bringing the devil to justice. Eventually, Ludwig returned and, slowly, nodded to verify that Gustav was dead. Hans slunk to his knees as he held his head in his hands, feeling the weight of his defeat. No one dared to say a word, and the room was ghastly silent as each man understood the consequences of Gustav's demise. Hevel returned his pistol to his holster as he stared at the floor. "I thought, somehow, that this would make me feel better." "Constable?" Ludwig spoke softly. "We should return." "We still need to find out who he is." Hevel gestured towards the man still on his knees, and what their involvement was. He turned towards Mrs. Meyers, who was still scowling at him. "I'm the one who killed Gustav Simon," the man replied. "You're also the man who's hiding his identity." Hevel spoke with less forcefulness than before. "Is this everyone in the house?" Hevel turned to Mrs. Meyers. "Apart from the cook, everyone is accounted for," Mrs. Meyers lied, which Hans thought was odd. What happened to Eleonore? He wondered, as his mind ran wild with imagination as to her fate. I also remember a rather unpleasant butler in Mrs. Meyers' employment. What is she hiding? "There was a woman," the maid, who had remained at the top of the stairs, interjected. "And a butler as well. They left out the back." "Is this true?" Hevel asked, and Hans noted that Mrs. Meyers was glaring at the girl for the admission. She must be protecting them, Hans frowned. But why? "I'll look for them." Hans took charge of the situation and began to leave. "No." Hevel raised a hand to stop him. "One of my men are better suited for this." "Find them." Hevel pointed at Ludwig, who, at once, headed for the back of the house. "Constable." Hans cleared his throat as he acted quickly. "If I may, I have gained considerable experience in the field of interrogation. May I suggest that you collect the body of Gustav, and we will return it for proper examination? While Ludwig is searching for this woman and butler, I will talk with Mrs. Meyers, this man, and the maid, to determine who is lying and what they are hiding." "All right." Hevel nodded gloomily, not entirely caring, as he was lost to his emptiness. Hans felt pity for the constable as he watched him turn and enter the cellar with slouched shoulders. Hevel had clearly lost someone of significance, and incorrectly believed that Gustav's death would return a semblance of justice. "Is there somewhere more private that we can talk?" Hans spoke cordially to Mrs. Meyers. "Talk?" Mrs. Meyers scoffed. "On whose authority? I have yet to be formally provided with any documentation as to who you are and why you have entered my property without permission." "Ma'am," Hans continued to speak respectfully, "I'm Captain Volker. I'm the individual who brought Eleonore Hodis to this house for her interview and subsequent employment. My primary concern lies with the fugitive, Gustav Simon, but this is closely followed by my care for Eleanor's safety and well-being." Studying Hans warily for a moment, Mrs. Meyers pointed towards a dining room behind him. "We can speak in there," she added softly. "I'll speak to you one at a time." Hans addressed the maid and the man. Following behind Mrs. Meyers as she slowly entered the dining room and sat in the chair that he assumed was her customary spot, Hans took the seat across from her as he inspected the surroundings. The house was well taken care of, and there were no signs of violence, and Hans assumed that Gustav had been killed where he was found, in the cellar. Retrieving a cigarette, Hans offered one to Mrs. Meyers as well, but was met with her terrifying stare of disapproval. "I forbid you or anyone to smoke in my house." Mrs. Meyers looked gravely at Hans. "Of course." Hans politely relented as he returned the casing to his breast pocket and instead retrieved his notepad. "I know you're out there," Ludwig could be heard shouting from outside the back of the house. "Under the authority of the police, you are to return at once." "I'm a friend of Eleanor's," Hans whispered as he ignored Ludwig's yelling. "Is she in any danger?" Mrs. Meyers didn't reply as she stared at Hans, and he assumed that she was assessing whether his intentions were sincere. "Mrs. Meyers, please," Hans pressed as he continued to whisper. "I need to know that she's all right. As I stated previously, I am the one who brought her here. I would be devastated to discover that I put her in harm's way. I need to know if I should be out there looking for her." Taking a deep breath, Mrs. Meyers looked at Hans with understanding. "The man that Miss Hodis departed with is of an immoral and licentious disposition, but I have no doubt that he will protect her." "She's with the butler?" Hans leaned in. "Why did she run away?" "She uncovered the truth that I was funding the resistance," Mrs. Meyers replied impassively, despite the implications of such a confession. "Earlier this morning she offered me her resignation. Later, when I was in my room, I heard a gunshot from somewhere in the house. Shortly afterwards, your constable started banging on the door, and I heard the back entrance open before you barged in. Neither Mr. Metalliano nor Miss Hodis are present, which, I gather, can only mean that they must have had something to do with his death." "Do you believe that this butler killed Gustav?" Hans awaited her reply eagerly. "Is Eleanore his hostage?" "I do not presume to believe anything that I have not seen with my own eyes." Mrs. Meyers looked away. "All I know is that I heard a shot, and they are no longer here." "I understand." Hans rubbed his eyes as the morning's defeats were piling up. "What I can say, however, is that if someone did, in fact, shoot Gustav, then they did so out of absolute necessity. Eleanore is a woman of quality who brings healing, not destruction." Mrs. Meyers' lips trembled before she muttered under her breath, "God knows I could use her courage now." "Do you know who that man is?" Hans glanced back out into the foyer. "I have seen him speaking from time to time with Gustav," Mrs. Meyers recalled, "but I am not privy to his identity." I hesitate to ask this. Hans shook his head as the gravity of the situation was still settling in. But we received your cryptic message that former SS were in the area, which is why we brought Eleonore here to report if anything suspicious arose. Why, then, am I now finding out that you, in fact, were harboring and funding them? The why is immaterial. Mrs. Meyers spoke coldly, but Hans could sense that this was not from a position of hatred, but rather from a deep, personal pain. All that matters is the who. I funded the resistance, therefore I am guilty of this treason, and I accept the punishment due my crimes. Hans sighed as he anxiously tapped the table with his index finger while studying her sincerity. If she's not his hostage, do you have any indication of where Eleonore might have gone? Hans pressed. I would suspect Italy. Mrs. Meyers swallowed and then held her chin high, as if even mentioning the name of the country somehow made her common. That is where Mr. Metalliano is from. Thank you, Hans nodded. I will speak with that man now. What is to become of me? Mrs. Meyers asked while staring into the table. That depends on the why. Hans studied her. Which, if you are concerned as to your fate, you will note has suddenly become material. My reasons are my own. Mrs. Meyers stood. Do what you will with that information. With all due respect, Mrs. Meyers. Hans stood as well. You will either tell me now, or you will confess before a judge. I can spare you that extra measure and humiliation. Family. Mrs. Meyers swallowed. I did it for family. Is Gustav or this other man related to you? Hans squinted, as he still didn't quite grasp her reasoning. Were you threatened or forced into this situation? Do you have children? Mrs. Meyers asked. No. Hans shook his head. Then you cannot possibly understand my motives. Mrs. Meyers spoke tiredly. Hans took in the woman before him as she prepared to take her leave. He wondered why Eleonore hadn't notified him of Mrs. Meyers' involvement, and supposed that she had good reason. Or maybe Eleonore was complicit. A more depressing thought entered his mind. No, it can't be. She would have told me. Still, why did Eleonore run? One last thing. Hans raised a finger to stop Mrs. Meyers from leaving. Your maid, the girl, who is she? Her name is Eva, Mrs. Meyers replied, still absent of much emotion, though I am unaware of her last name or her true identity. I am, however, mindful that she is part of the resistance. What part she is playing, or her ranking, that I am unfamiliar with. Thank you, Hans sighed, realizing his error in judgment in leaving Eleonore alone at this establishment. He prayed that she was not in danger now, or, at least, that she had forgiven him. Huffing from exhaustion, Hans returned to sitting as Mrs. Meyers left the dining room and one of the policemen brought in the man and roughly set him down on the chair across from Hans. Easy, Hans barked at the policeman, who seemed slightly ashamed by his behavior, but then left without an apology. Please pardon his conduct. Hans looked at the man across from him, who didn't reply as he stared into the table without acknowledgement of Hans's regret. Taking note of the man's composure under pressure, Hans assumed that he was dealing with a member of the SS, and of possibly higher ranking. State your name, please, Hans demanded, as he spoke less cordially than before and prepared to write in his notepad. Jung, the man replied quietly. Jung? Hans glanced up at him. Do you have a first name, Mr. Jung? Otto, Jung replied as he swallowed. How did you come to work at the manor, Otto? Hans studied him thoroughly. If it's all the same to you, I'd appreciate being addressed formally. Jung spoke firmly, though he remained staring at the table. Of course, Mr. Jung. Hans frowned at the peculiarity, but complied regardless. Now, Mr. Jung, if you would be so kind as to answer the question. I didn't, Jung replied quickly. You didn't what, sorry? Hans furrowed his brow and suspected that the man across from him was hiding something sinister. I was answering your question. Jung gestured to Hans's notepad. I asked how you came to work at the manor, and you replied that you didn't. Hans examined Jung, who nodded quickly in agreement. "Mr. Jung," Hans leaned forward, "I require your full cooperation. I am a war crimes investigator who has arrived here with the intention of arresting Gustav, only to find that he has been killed. Now, can you advise me, honestly and completely, who killed Gustav Simon?" "I'm not familiar with anyone by that name." Jung cleared his throat. "It'll be easier if you turn yourself in now!" The guard from outside shouted again, but further out into the garden. This caught Jung's attention, and he glanced out the dining-room window with wide eyes. Realizing that Hans was watching him, Jung returned his focus to the table and pretended to be unconcerned with the guard looking for Eleonore and the butler. "You're playing for time." Hans stood slowly, beginning to unravel the peculiarity of Jung's behavior. "Playing for time?" Jung replied innocently, but Hans saw through his act. "She killed Gustav?" Hans watched Jung intensely and in disbelief, but Jung gave no reply. "All this time I thought it was the butler, but now I understand why Mrs. Meyers was protecting her. Eleanor killed him? Didn't she?" Hans slammed his fist on the table, which frightened Jung slightly, though he remained silent. "I've got to find her before she makes an unfortunate and terrible mistake." Hans began to run out of the dining room. Before he could get far, Hans was tackled from behind, and he fell to the floor as the wind was knocked out of him. Then, in a swift and fluid motion, a strong arm squeezed tightly around his neck and began to choke him. Hans struggled to regain his footing, but Jung was skilled in restraint. "Get off of him, now!" Hevel came to Hans's aid and trained his pistol on Jung. "Tell your men to stop searching for her." Jung spoke to Hevel as he threatened to squeeze tighter. "Why?" Hans struggled to breathe and grabbed onto Jung's arm to try and alleviate the pressure. "I killed Gustav," Jung shouted. "She has nothing to do with it." "Then why," Hans gasped for air, "is she running?" "I will not hesitate," Hevel warned as he moved closer to Jung and stood over him and Hans. "Say it," Jung screamed. All right, Hans tapped Jung's arm. "Hevel, call him back." "He's obviously SS," Hevel persisted. "I'll just shoot him, and then we'll track down this woman of yours." Hans shook his head as he looked at Hevel with wide eyes, begging him to relent. Glancing between Hans and Jung, Hevel finally yielded and withdrew as Hans gasped for air after Jung had released his grip. "Now what?" Hevel asked. "Go call your man back." Hans waved and rubbed his throat. "We'll take Jung in for questioning." But just as Hans spoke, Ludwig returned to the house, panting and sweating. Bending over, Ludwig put his hands to his knees as he tried to catch his breath. "Well?" Hevel grew impatient. "We just missed them," Ludwig spoke between breaths. "They're likely headed into town." "You don't need them anyways," Jung interjected. "I'm Gustav's killer. Take me." "Whatever you are, you're a poor liar." Hans shook his head, feeling lost. "There's only one reason Eleanore would have fled in the fashion which she did. If only she knew that these men were intending on killing Gustav anyways." "Wait, what?" Jung couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Her fate is in her own hands now." Hans rubbed his eyes in despair. "This was all my fault. I believe it's best if we return at once." Hevel spoke quietly. "Put Mr. Jung and Eva into the truck. We will take them for questioning." Hans signaled to the other policemen. "And what is to be my fate?" Mrs. Meyers asked as she watched Hans warily. "You lost all your sons in the war?" Hans asked with sympathy. Mrs. Meyers nodded slowly. "And your husband?" Hans continued tenderly. Again Mrs. Meyers nodded slowly. "Then I think that you have suffered more than most." At this Mrs. Meyers crumpled and held on to the banister as she slumped down and sat at the bottom of the stairs. She watched vacantly as Eva and Jung were taken, and she was yet again alone. Then she watched as the policemen dragged Gustav's body up the stairs and out the main doors, not concerned that his blood should stain the floor, and then the earth as he was dragged outside. Feeling that there was nothing more that he could say to her, Hans reached out to touch her on the shoulder, but then retracted the gesture, and, turning away, he left her in silence. "There's not enough room for all of us and the body," Ludwig complained to Hevel. "Strap Gustav to the bike rack on the back of the truck." Hans pointed to the rope. "You can't be serious." Ludwig looked at Hans with incredulity. "A fitting parade of shame for such an immoral man." Hevel nodded firmly. "Do it." Grumbling, Ludwig obeyed. He and the other men heaved the dead weight of Gustav Simon's pale corpse onto a blanket, wrapped him carelessly, and then struggled to secure the stiff, as they began to call it, onto the bike rack. Then the policemen escorted Young and Eva into the transport truck, and Eva, who had remained mostly silent, was now a weeping mess. Although much too tired to concern himself with the details, Hans supposed that Eva held some antipathy towards Eleonore, as she showed no reservation in exposing where she had fled. With the company loaded into the truck, Hans started the vehicle and was about to drive away when he took one last look at the manor in the side mirror. He wondered if the fate he had left Mrs. Meyers to was crueler than taking her in for interrogation and possible processing, but his conscience was momentarily distracted with his overbearing worry for Eleonore. He had placed her in this position. Although he had done so without the knowledge of the sinister men in Mrs. Meyers' employment, he still felt the burden of guilt for the precarious arrangement she now found herself in. Whatever the case, Hans thought as he began to drive away, all that matters is that she's safe. God, I hope that she's safe. Chapter 2. The Great Escape. There is no greater sorrow than to recall our times of joy in wretchedness. Dante Alighieri, Inferno. "No!" Eleanore shook her head as she frowned. "No?" Ben fluttered his eyes in surprise. "I'm not going to accept a marriage proposal just after I killed a man." Eleanore couldn't believe that she had to explain her reasoning to him. "Firstly," Ben held up his finger, "he was a Nazi, not a man. Secondly, what I'm proposing is a union of convenience, not affection." "Why is affection to be excluded?" Eleanore grew stern. "Well, that's not—" Ben stumbled and then shook his head as he waved his hand in the air. "We can discuss the details later." "Come on out!" a voice shouted from a distance. "We have to leave, now." Ben grabbed his luggage, then took Eleanor's hand as he led her to the back of the cottage, where he struggled to open the door. "Come on." Ben threw his shoulder against the door as he heaved, but it wouldn't budge, and Eleanore understood that this exit was rarely, if ever, used. "I know you're out there!" The voice came closer. "Hurry!" Eleanore panicked and tapped Ben's arm as she looked anxiously back at the front door, which had been left open. "That's not helping," Ben barked. Then, holding his arm out to shield her, Ben took a generous step back before delivering a strong kick squarely on the door, which burst open under the pressure. Swiftly, the two exited the cabin and ran with their heads low. Leading her by the hand, Ben took Eleanore through a row of trees lining a hill. The pine needles and acorns stabbed Eleanor's feet through her thin shoes, but she knew there was little that could alleviate the discomfort, and no time to address the conditions. Staying out of view, Ben led her around the side of the hill, and, when they had come to a safe distance, he stopped and looked back in the direction of the cottage. "What are you doing?" Eleanore whispered. "I want to make sure that we weren't followed," Ben whispered back. "What difference does it make?" Eleanore asked, as she bent over and looked at her trembling hands. "It will depend on which route we take. If we were followed, we'll go through the stream." He pointed to the west. "There are farmyards and passageways where we can lose them. If not, we'll take the straight path into town, though we should keep our distance from the road." "You've planned for this eventuality, haven't you?" Eleanore watched him warily. "It was only a matter of time before someone came for me." Ben looked at Eleanore softly. "I just never expected to be employing such methods for someone else." Noticing Ben's soft expression, Eleanore blushed slightly that he should carry such affections for her. There was still much left unsaid between them, and Eleanore wasn't entirely sure how to broach the subjects again, though she supposed it was entirely likely that they would reappear organically. "I don't think we've been followed." Ben sighed his relief. "Good," Eleanore nodded. I was dreading having...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?